Why people stop defending Windows after trying Linux isn't really a story about software. It's a story about perspective, expectations, and that quiet moment when someone realizes their relationship with their computer has changed in a way they didn't expect. Most people don't switch operating systems because they're bored. They switch because something nudges them, sometimes gently, sometimes out of pure frustration. It might start with a slow laptop that used to feel fast, a forced update at the worst possible time, or the simple curiosity sparked by a friend, a video or a forum post saying, "You should try Linux." At first, there's skepticism, sometimes even loyalty to Windows, because it's familiar, it's what they've always used, and it's what the world around them uses. But curiosity is powerful, and once someone installs a Linux distribution, whether it's in a virtual machine, on an old spare computer, or as a dual boot alongside Windows, a subtle shift begins. The first thing many people notice isn't some dramatic feature or flashy interface. It's the feeling of control. On Windows, the experience is largely predefined. The system decides when to update, what runs in the background, how certain settings are buried, and how much influence the user really has. With Linux, the relationship feels reversed. Instead of the computer telling the user how things will be, the user tells the computer what they want. Even for beginners who don't touch the terminal much, the knowledge that the system can be shaped, customized, and understood creates a psychological shift. Suddenly the computer feels less like an appliance and more like a tool. Performance often becomes the second turning point. Many people try Linux on older hardware because they assume it won't run well on Windows anymore, and they're surprised when the machine feels responsive again. Applications open faster, the desktop feels lighter, and the system seems to respect the limits of the hardware instead of constantly pushing against them. This doesn't mean Linux is magically faster in every scenario, but the perception of efficiency is powerful. When a device that felt obsolete suddenly feels usable, it creates a sense of discovery, like uncovering hidden potential that was always there. Then there's the learning curve, which is often framed as a negative but frequently becomes a source of engagement. At first, small things feel unfamiliar, like installing software through a package manager instead of downloading random installers or navigating different desktop environments. But instead of frustration alone, many users feel curiosity. They start to understand how their system works, what processes are running, where files live, and why certain design choices exist. This learning process creates ownership. When you learn something, you invest in it, and once you feel invested, your attachment changes. Another factor that quietly reshapes opinions is the absence of friction people didn't even realize they were tolerating. Things like unexpected restarts, aggressive notifications, pre-installed apps they never asked for, and the subtle sense that the system is always doing something behind the scenes for reasons that aren't entirely clear. When those frictions disappear or become optional, users often feel a sense of calm computing. It's not about perfection. Linux has its own quirks and challenges. But the overall feeling of transparency can be refreshing, and once you experience that, it's hard to ignore the contrast. Software availability used to be one of the biggest arguments for defending Windows, and for some workflows it still is, especially in highly specialized professional environments. But for many everyday users, the gap has narrowed significantly. Web-based tools, cross-platform apps, and open-source alternatives mean that email, browsing, coding, content creation, and even gaming are increasingly viable. When people realize they can do most or all of what they need without compromise, the primary reason they defended Windows begins to fade. It's not that Windows suddenly becomes bad. It's that the exclusivity argument weakens. Community also plays a surprisingly large role. Windows is a product, but Linux often feels like an ecosystem of people. Forums, documentation, chat rooms, and tutorials create an environment where users feel supported by other users, rather than just guided by official help pages. When someone runs into a problem and finds a detailed explanation written by another person who faced the same issue, it creates a sense of shared experience. That human element changes how people perceive the operating system, turning it from a product into a community space. Privacy is another turning point, though its importance varies from person to person. Some users switch without caring much about data collection, but once they experience a system that asks less, tracks less, and gives clearer control over what runs and what connects, they begin to think differently about what they previously accepted as normal. It's not always about fear. Often it's about preference. When you realize you can have a fully functional system without feeling like you're constantly being observed or nudged, your baseline expectations shift. Customization often becomes the feature people didn't know they wanted. The ability to change the desktop environment, tweak animations, adjust workflows, or even replace entire components of the system creates a sense of personal expression. Instead of adapting to the operating system's design philosophy, the operating system adapts to the user. This doesn't matter to everyone, but for those who enjoy shaping their environment, it can be transformative. Once you've built a setup that feels uniquely yours, going back to a more locked-down environment can feel restrictive. Stability is another subtle influence. While no operating system is immune to bugs, many users report that once they find a Linux setup that works for them, it tends to keep working without major surprises. Updates rarely feel disruptive, and the system often behaves predictably. Predictability builds trust, and trust changes loyalty. When you trust your tools, you stop defending them out of habit and start appreciating them out of experience. The shift in mindset is gradual. People rarely wake up one day and decide they're done defending Windows. Instead, they notice small moments. The first time an update doesn't interrupt their work. The first time they fix an issue themselves with a quick search. The first time they realize their system feels faster after months of use instead of slower. These moments accumulate until the narrative they tell themselves changes. Instead of saying, Linux is interesting but Windows is what I'll stick with, they start saying, Windows works, but I prefer this. Interestingly, many people don't become anti-Windows after switching. The change is less about rejection and more about perspective. Once you've seen a different approach to computing, the idea that there's only one normal way disappears. Windows becomes one option among many, rather than the default that must be defended. That shift from loyalty to choice is at the heart of the transformation. Workflows also evolve. Linux often encourages habits like using lightweight tools, automating repetitive tasks, and organizing work more intentionally. Over time, these habits can make users feel more efficient and deliberate in how they use their computers. Efficiency reinforces preference, and preference gradually replaces brand loyalty. When your daily routine feels smoother, you naturally gravitate toward the environment that supports it. Another psychological factor is the sense of discovery. Trying Linux can feel like rediscovering computing itself, especially for people who grew up with technology feeling increasingly opaque. Exploring settings, learning commands, and understanding system behavior brings back a sense of curiosity that many people associate with earlier experiences with computers. That emotional connection can be surprisingly strong, and once computing feels fun again, it's hard to dismiss the platform that rekindled that feeling. The conversation around cost also plays a role. Even when people weren't consciously thinking about licensing or subscription models, using a system that is freely available and openly developed changes how they think about value. It reinforces the idea that powerful tools don't always have to come with restrictive terms, and that philosophy resonates with many users, even if it wasn't their original motivation for switching. Over time, defending Windows starts to feel unnecessary because the debate itself becomes less relevant. When you're comfortable and productive in your environment, you don't feel the need to justify it. You simply use what works for you. And once you've experienced multiple ecosystems, you recognize that each has strengths and trade-offs. The emotional energy that once went into defending a platform shifts into choosing the right tool for the task. There's also an element of confidence that grows with familiarity. The more comfortable people become with Linux, the less intimidating it feels, and the more they realize they can handle challenges that once seemed technical or complex. That confidence spills over into how they talk about operating systems in general. Instead of repeating common assumptions, they speak from experience, and experience tends to be more nuanced than brand loyalty. In the end, why people stop defending Windows after trying Linux isn't because Windows suddenly fails them or because Linux is perfect. It's because exposure changes expectations. Once you've seen a system that emphasizes control, transparency, efficiency, and community in a different balance, you realize there isn't a single standard for what an operating system should feel like. That realization removes the need to defend one platform as the default choice. The journey is less about switching sides and more about expanding perspective. Trying Linux shows people that computing can be flexible, personal, and shaped by their preferences rather than dictated by convention. And when that understanding settles in, defending any single operating system starts to feel beside the point. What matters is how the technology fits into your life, supports your work, and aligns with what you value in a digital environment. So the real answer isn't that people abandon Windows. It's that they outgrow the idea that they need to defend it. They've seen another way, experienced the benefits firsthand, and discovered that choice is more powerful than habit. And once you internalize that, the conversation shifts from which operating system is right to which one feels right for you. And that's a much more interesting place to be.